Our reading for today comes from Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. It can be found on page 1226 of your Bibles. Ephesians chapter 4, verses 14 through 16. They will no longer be infants, tossed back and forth by the waves, and blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of men in their deceitful scheming. Instead, speaking the truth in love, we will in all things grow up into Him who is the head, that is Christ. From Him the whole body, joined and held together by every supporting ligament, grows and builds itself up in love, as each part does its work. This is the word of the Lord. At Oakdale, where Gil and I and the boys attend church, we're currently preaching through our core values at Oakdale. One of the core values that we have there is communications. And the core value is that we always call for thorough communication and love. So our communication should always be marked by love. And when we think about that, a couple of questions come to mind. First, what should we be communicating to one another? And secondly, what does communicating that message to one another in love look like? So I'd like for you to imagine with me, if you will, an older man. His name is John Smith. And John lived by himself in this really old house. And he'd lived there for a really long time. He was once married and had children, but went through a bitter divorce, and his wife and the kids moved out of state. He hadn't talked to them or seen his kids in decades. John retired a few years ago, and after he retired, the stock market crashed. He lost a lot of his money that he had planned on for retirement, so he had a very small monthly income. He was a lonely man, and in his loneliness, he spent a lot of time in his old house. And given his financial situation and in an old house, the house was in dire need of repair. Whenever it rained, water would come dripping through the roof. And the windows were so old and cracked that when the wind would blow in the wintertime, if you sat a candle next to the window, it would blow it right out. And his bathroom sink, the handles came off of the faucet. So whenever he wanted to turn on the water in his bathroom, he'd have to break out a pair of pliers and twist it open and twist it shut. In his loneliness and his uncomfortable house, John had become a hermit. He'd shut himself off from the rest of the world. He had no interest in getting to know his neighbors. If Girl Scouts came to his door trying to sell Girl Scout cookies, he'd slam the door in their face. One day, a woman pulled up into his driveway in this beautiful Mercedes-Benz, just a very expensive car. And John looked out his window and thought, what is this rich lady doing at my house? See, John had a problem with rich people. Those bankers had taken all that money and they had put it in risky schemes trying to make huge profits, and it wasn't even their money. It was people like John's money, and they had lost a bunch of it. So when he saw this lady pulling up in the driveway in a Mercedes-Benz, kind of irked him a little bit. Did she want to take the rest of his money that he had left? He didn't have much left. But she came and knocked on the door, and John just ignored her. And she was pretty persistent. She stayed out there for a while, knocking on the door. And then he saw her trying to look through the windows to see if anybody was in there. And finally she yelled out, "Hello, anybody home? I'm looking for John Smith." And he didn't answer. He just stayed quiet. She went away, and the next day she came back and she did the same thing. Day after day this happened for about a week. Finally, John went and opened the door and said, "John Smith doesn't live here anymore. John Smith is dead. And if you come at my house again, I'm going to call the cops." So she went away, never to return. The next fall, John passed away, and his funeral was sparsely populated. But one of the people that were there was this lady. She had come to the funeral because she got a phone call that she was the nearest of kin to John Smith. She was his daughter. She had come looking for him the year earlier because she thought her father might want some company, that he might need some financial resources, some help, some love. And John, in his ignorance, not knowing who she was, made himself unavailable to her. His ignorance closed him off from this loving relationship that would have helped him with his daughter. And there's a famous saying, and we've heard it a lot before, and that's that ignorance is bliss. But I don't believe ignorance is bliss at all, and I think this situation illustrates it. Ignorance can be painful. In our text today, Paul sounds a warning about ignorance. He talks about people being tossed back and forth by waves, blown here and there by every wind of teaching, and by the cunning and craftiness of men and their deceitful scheming. For Paul, this wasn't just some abstract idea. It was a reality at his time when he was writing his letters to the churches. See, there was this group of people at that time that had already started corrupting the gospel, the real message of the gospel. And one of these groups they were called Gnostics. And the Gnostics believed that everything that is physical is bad. That the only thing that can be good is those things that are spiritual. And that might not sound too far out. I mean, this is a Reformed church, and we believe that man and woman has fallen, that we're naturally inclined away from good, that we're naturally inclined away from Jesus. And so what's the difference here? Well, the difference is that God made everything good. All things were made good. And if the flesh is not good, if your physical body is not good, then how could Jesus have come in the flesh? Jesus was good, right? So the Gnostics were forced to assume that since the flesh is bad, the physical is bad, that Jesus didn't actually come in the flesh. Okay? And that might not even sound like a big deal, but let's think about it. What did Jesus come here to do? He came here to be the second Adam, to stand in our stead before God. And if he wasn't truly human, then when he went out into the desert before his temptation for 40 days fasting, he didn't really get hungry. And if he wasn't really flesh, if he wasn't really physical, when he was praying to his Lord before his crucifixion, that if it be possible that this cup be taken from